Okay. We know that whether type 1 diabetes is going to get treated or not, it depends on the person's education, income, occupation, maybe neighborhood, maybe asset and land ownership and wealth, right? SES determines whether a person can or cannot get treatment for type 1 diabetes. And if this is untreated, it can lead to excessive glucose level, which in turn damage the blood vessel, damage the nerves and other organs. We can see comorbidity manifested in here. Not only if the person has type 1 diabetes, the person also has nerve problems and damaged organs. And untreated type 1 diabetes can also lead to diabetic ketoacidosis or acidic bloodstream. It worsens a person's health. Also a manifestation of multi-comorbidity. And the treatment for type 1 diabetes is not cheap. So a person's socio-economic status determines whether the person is aware of treatment or can afford treatment. Am I right? And if you Google, the costs are not cheap. The price may vary, but the costs are never cheap. And what about type 2 diabetes? These are the causes. Even though it's not exhaustive, people are still doing research. Chronic stress. It has something to do with a person's occupation or maybe income. And a person's education determines a person's occupation and income. So SES has something to do with this, as we can see. Am I right? And having Cushing's disease can also increase the risk for type 2 diabetes. We see a comorbidity in here. And whether the Cushing disease can be treated or people can afford treatment for Cushing disease or Cushing disease is determined by the person's education, income, social class, occupation, and so on. Am I right? So the second feature is manifested in here. Social economic statuses influence the risk for Cushing disease, which in turn influence the risk for type 2 diabetes. And having a sedentary lifestyle can also increase the risk for type 2 diabetes. So the first feature is manifested in this example through chronic stress and sedentary lifestyle. Obesity is another risk factor. It can also be a legit medical condition. So the first two features are manifested in this example. High blood pressure, social economic statuses, education, income, occupation, and so on, determines whether the person is aware about the health implications of hypertension. Or SES also determines whether the person can afford treatment for hypertension. And this in turn influence the risk for type 2 diabetes. Steroid use, social economic statuses, education, income, and occupation, and so on, determines whether the person is aware about the health implications of steroids. Right. And social economic statuses also determines whether the person can or cannot afford steroids. which in turn influence the risk of type 2 diabetes. And another factor is family history, genetics. And a person's education, income, and occupation determines whether the person is aware that type 2 diabetes can be genetics. So as we can see, social economic statuses, they work through all these intermediary mechanisms to influence a particular disease risk, as we can see. A person's social economic statuses determines where they can or cannot afford to live, determines what kind of food the person has access to, whether healthy or unhealthy. So here are more of the risk factors. Social economic statuses, especially a person's income and occupation, determines the stress level of a given job, which in turn influence the risk for type 2 diabetes. The same for alcohol abuse. And a person's education, income, occupation, and so on determines whether the person is aware about the health implications of type 2 diabetes and what is going to happen if it is left untreated. It can cause renal failure and amputation. So this is another manifestation of the fundamental cause theory. Can we say that? Question? Okay. What about gestational diabetes? Here are all the risk factors. History, prior history. I think these are the genes or alleles, I don't know. Who knows? I think these are the genes. Yeah, I prepared this a while ago. And I don't recall, I'm sorry. And certain ethnic groups are more prone to having certain genetic makeups. And having fetal macrosomia in prior pregnancies is another risk factor. And weight gain, excessive weight gain during pregnancy is also a risk factor. Being overweight or obese, having BMI that is greater than 30. People who are in the middle age, 45 and over, is also in the high risk groups. And hormonal change that blocks insulin and sedentary behaviors or unhealthy diet can also be an indirect risk factors we can see. So unhealthy diet can increase the person's risk for obesity and being overweight, or can influence weight gain during pregnancy. The kind of diet quality can determine whether the person is going to gain weight or not during gestation. And a person's income, education, occupation, and so on determines whether the person is aware of all these risk factors, what hormonal change is going to do to the risk of gestational diabetes, and why certain ethnic groups have certain compositions of certain hormones, or how history of gestational diabetes can increase the present gestational diabetes. And the person can also be aware that having fetal macrosomia in prior pregnancy can also increase the risk for gestational diabetes. And a person's education, occupation, income, and so on can also determine whether the person is going to be aware that if gestation diabetes is left untreated, it can increase the risk of hypertension, hypoglycemia, and high birth weight. So, in this case, I think the first two features are manifested in this example. Or maybe the third feature, maybe having exercise programs or crime prevention can make a neighborhood safer for people to exercise, improving the transportation program. At the same time, reducing crime can make people more inclined to travel to other places to get access to healthy food. Deployment of resources, as shown in this diagram, can also minimize the risk factors. So I take it back. The three features of fundamental cost theory are portrayed in the case of gestational diabetes. Question? Okay. If no question, let's look at skin cancer. Okay. So these are all the risk factors for skin cancer. Low level of melanin can lead to how the rays penetrate to the deeper level of the skin. And this can influence the UV exposure, which in turn affects the melanoma. And having aging skin affects the absorption of UV rays, especially for Caucasians. And this is going to affect the skin cell mutation, which affects how the melanoma is going to function. And living in areas close to arsenic or contaminated water sources can damage the skin cell's DNA. This can in turn increase the risk for skin cancer. And as we can see, a person's education, income and occupation and so on determines where the person is going to live and whether the neighborhood has good water quality or not. So SES can influence the risk for skin cancer through being exposed to contaminated water, which damage the skin cell DNA. This is another manifestation of fundamental cost theory. Can we see that? And tanning beds can also damage the skin cell DNA, which in turn increase the risk for skin cancer. And a person's socio-economic statuses determines whether the person is aware of the health implications of tanning beds, or the person's education, income, occupation, and so on determines whether the person can or cannot afford to tan their skin. And working under the sun for long periods of time, this has something to do with the person's occupation and income. Can also damage the skin cell DNA. And this can increase the risk for skin cancer. And a person's education, income, and occupation, and so on, determines whether the person is aware of the processes or the pathways that lead to the risk for skin cancer. So I think this is another manifestation of the fundamental cost theory. Question? Here are the treatment for skin cancer. And if you Google the price, they are not cheap. So a person's income, education, occupation, and so on determines whether the person can or cannot afford treatment. Okay. Let's look at the last PDF file in this week module. This focuses on the health implications of being a farmer. We know a farmer is exposed to all kinds of pesticides. Or sometimes the farmer, they water the plants. If they are not careful, they can fall or they can injure themselves. When the farmer is spraying all these chemicals, agri-chemicals, pesticides, it can affect their brain, skin, eyes, it can affect their cognitive performance, and it can lead to all kinds of poisoning. And a farmer's education level determines whether the farmer is aware of all this. And we know there are many kinds of farmers, right? Some are high-tech, some are less well-off. They cannot afford all these new innovations. So, as you can see, I think the fundamental cost theory is also portrayed in this example, in the case of farmers. And being exposed to all these things can increase the risk for farmer's lung or cellular disease. And prolonged standing can also has all kinds of health implications, bad aches, falls, injuries, and whatnot. Swollen feet, knee problems decades later, back surgery decades later. And how they store or dispose these chemicals can also lead to all kinds of health implications. And sometimes farmers, they are being attacked by wild animals. It can take a toll on their mental and physical health. It can cause burns, injuries, bleedings, all kinds of things. And sometimes the farming area is not safe. It can be slippery. The farmers can have a high risk for fall and other kinds of injuries. Or thorny weeds can also lead to injuries. And whether the farmers is aware of all this is dependent on the farmer's education, income, occupation, and so on. So I think this is another portrayal of the fundamental cost theory. And sometimes depends on the crop. Depending on the crop, the farmer may have to stand in the water for long periods of time. This can lead to the loss of essential electrodes, including sodium, potassium, which increase the farmer's risk for dehydration. And it can increase the risk for headaches, fatigues, and nausea. And sometimes maybe seizures and coma. the health implications of standing in the water for too long, like farmers in tropical countries in paddy fields. They are prone to all these risks, which increase their risk for diseases and illnesses like headaches, and the risk for some contested illnesses, fatigue, nausea. And standing in the water for long periods of time can also lead to the loss of sebum, which makes the skin waterproof and cause the skin to become waterlogged and wrinkly. So farmers may develop skin problems years to come. So these are the risk factors. So as you can see, the fundamental cost theory is also portrayed in the health implications of farming. And standing in the water for too long can also reduce the farmer's ability to hold water, can lead to depletion of lipids and other natural moisturizing factors. And this ultimately lead to other long-term problems. So I think the fundamental cost theory applies in here.